Chester had never liked hunting. That was the first thing I told Edgar when he invited me to spend the weekend at his grandfather's old hunting cabin. "You don't actually have to hunt," he said over the phone, sounding amused. "I just don't feel like going alone." "Then why call it a hunting cabin?" "Because that's what it is. Doesn't mean we have to shoot anything." I leaned back in my chair and stared out the apartment window. We'd known each other for almost 4 years. We'd met during our first semester of college, survived terrible roommates, impossible exams, and enough all-night study sessions to know each other's coffee orders by heart. Edgar was the kind of guy everyone assumed had his life figured out. Calm, confident, the friend who never raised his voice because he never had to. He was also painfully straight, or at least that's what I believed. "So," he asked after a few seconds of silence, "how far is this cabin?" 3 hours. "Any electricity?" "Most of the time." "That's not reassuring." He laughed. "I'll drive. You bring snacks." I still think this sounds like the opening of a horror movie. "If I wanted to murder you, Chester, I'd pick somewhere with better cell service." "See? That doesn't help." He laughed even harder. That was usually how things went between us. I finally agreed. Not because I cared about the cabin, because Edgar almost never asked anyone for company. Friday afternoon arrived faster than I expected. Edgar's pickup truck looked exactly like him. Clean without trying too hard. Practical. Nothing flashy. He rolled down the passenger window as I walked across the parking lot. "You packed enough clothes?" "I packed enough to survive civilization disappearing." He looked at my duffel bag. "That's all. I thought you said weekend, not 6 months." He nodded approvingly. "Good." As we pulled onto the highway, the city slowly disappeared behind us. For the first hour, we mostly listened to music. Not because we had nothing to say, because silence between us had never been uncomfortable. Eventually, Edgar glanced over. "You've been quiet. I'm wondering what convinced you to spend a weekend in the woods." He shrugged. "My grandfather left me the place." I didn't know that. Didn't tell many people. I noticed the way his expression changed. Less relaxed. Like he'd wandered into a conversation he wasn't sure he wanted. "You okay?" "Yeah." He tapped the steering wheel. "Just haven't been there in a while." I didn't push. Edgar always talked eventually. Trying to force it never worked. The highway narrowed into country roads. Then gravel. Then what barely qualified as a road at all. Trees surrounded us from every direction. The cabin appeared almost without warning. It wasn't fancy. Dark wood. Stone chimney. Wide porch. A weathered swing that moved gently in the breeze despite there being almost no wind. It looks, I searched for the right word, lonely. Edgar smiled faintly. "Yeah." He parked beside an old woodshed. The silence out there felt different from city silence. Not empty. Alive. Birds somewhere overhead. Leaves moving softly. The distant sound of water. I breathed in cold pine air. I kind of hate how peaceful this is. "You'll survive." I haven't ruled out getting eaten by a bear. "No bears." "You sound very confident." "I've only seen deer." "That's somehow worse." He laughed again. Inside, the cabin felt frozen in time. Old photographs. Handmade furniture. Bookshelves filled with faded hunting journals. A cast-iron stove. 2 bedrooms connected by a narrow hallway. No internet. I asked hopefully. "No." "No television?" "No." I stared at him. "So your entertainment plan is?" He pointed toward a stack of board games. "I brought cards." I should have stayed home. "You say that now." We unpacked before sunset. Afterward, Edgar suggested walking down to the lake behind the cabin. The trail curved through tall pines before opening into a quiet stretch of water reflecting the orange evening sky. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, I broke the silence. "You came here a lot growing up?" "Every fall." "With your grandfather?" He nodded. "He taught me almost everything I know." "You must miss him." Edgar looked across the lake. "Every day." There was enough honesty in those 3 words that I didn't know how to answer. So I simply stood beside him. Sometimes friendship looked like conversation. Sometimes it looked like letting silence do the work. Back at the cabin, we cooked the easiest dinner imaginable. Soup, bread, coffee. I thought hunting cabins meant steaks. I joked. "I told you. We're not hunting." He smiled. "I never liked it much either." That surprised me. "Seriously?" "My grandfather loved being out here." He looked toward the window. "I mostly like spending time with him." That made more sense. The fire crackled in the stone fireplace as darkness settled outside. Rain started unexpectedly, gentle at first. then heavy enough to drum against the roof. "We're definitely stuck here now," I said. Edgar didn't seem bothered. "That's kind of the point. The point was trapping me in the woods. The point was getting away from everything." He stared into the fire for a long moment. Then he quietly added, "I've needed that." There was something different about him tonight. Not unhappy, just carrying something. Something he'd brought with him all the way from the city. I wondered if this trip had less to do with the cabin than he'd admitted. Around midnight, we finally headed toward our rooms. "Good night," I said. "Night." I closed my bedroom door. The rain continued outside. The cabin creaked softly with every gust of wind. I expected to fall asleep immediately. Instead, I found myself thinking about Edgar, about the strange sadness I'd seen in him all evening, about the fact that he'd specifically invited me, not anyone else. Me. I told myself I was reading too much into it. I'd gotten good at that over the years, especially with straight friends. Eventually, exhaustion won. Just before sleep finally claimed me, I heard a floorboard creak somewhere in the hallway. Then another. Someone was awake. And for reasons I couldn't explain, I knew it was Edgar. The next morning, I woke up to complete silence. For a second, I forgot where I was. Then I smelled fresh coffee. I pulled on a hoodie and stepped into the hallway. Edgar was already standing in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with 2 mugs. He looked like he'd been awake for hours. "You sleep at all?" I asked. He slid 1 mug toward me. "Enough. You don't look convinced." "I've never slept well here." That surprised me. "You practically grew up coming to this place." "I know." He gave a small smile that disappeared almost immediately. "Doesn't always help." Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the forest washed clean. Sunlight filtered through the trees, making everything glow with that strange golden light you only see after a storm. "I want to show you something," Edgar said. "As long as it isn't a dead deer." He laughed. "No dead deer." "Good." We followed another trail deeper into the woods. Unlike the path to the lake, this one was barely visible. Branches brushed against our shoulders. The ground was soft beneath our boots. "You know where we're going?" I asked. "I could walk this trail blindfolded." "That's oddly specific. My grandfather used to joke about it." We walked another 15 minutes before the trees suddenly opened into a wide clearing. In the center stood an old fire tower. It hadn't been used in years. The wooden stairs looked weathered but solid. "You want to climb that?" "I've climbed it since I was 10. That's not exactly reassuring." Edgar was already halfway up before I finished talking. I sighed. "If I die because of splinters, I'm haunting you. You'll have to climb back down first." The view from the top stole every complaint I'd planned to make. Miles of untouched forest stretched in every direction. The lake shimmered below us. The cabin looked impossibly small. "Damn," I whispered. "Yeah." Neither of us spoke for several minutes. The wind carried the scent of pine through the open platform. Edgar rested his elbows on the railing. "I used to come up here whenever I wanted to think." "About what?" "Everything." He looked toward the mountains in the distance. "My grandfather said people hear themselves better when there's nothing else making noise." "Did it work?" He thought for a while. "Sometimes." As we climbed back down, one of the old wooden steps cracked beneath my foot. I froze. "Oh, you've got to be kidding." Edgar turned instantly. "Don't move." I wasn't planning on it. He carefully climbed back toward me. "You okay?" "I think so." The step held, but barely. He reached out instinctively. I grabbed his forearm. For a brief moment, we simply stayed like that. Not because either of us needed help anymore. Because neither of us moved. "You've got me," he said quietly. His voice sounded different. Lower. More serious than before. I let go first. "Thanks." "No problem." The walk back down felt strangely quieter. Back at the cabin, we spent the afternoon cleaning. Apparently, Edgar couldn't stay there without finding something to fix. Loose cabinet doors. Broken porch railing. Old boxes in the attic. "You really came here to work." "I think better when my hands are busy. I think better when someone else works." He threw a dust cloth at me. "Very funny." "I'm serious." He smiled. "I know." Late in the afternoon, we discovered an old cardboard box hidden behind several crates. Dust covered the lid. Edgar frowned. "I haven't seen this before." Inside were dozens of photographs. Most were of his grandfather. Some showed Edgar as a teenager. Skinny. Messy hair. Trying very hard not to smile. "You were awkward." "I know. This one is especially terrible." He reached over to grab the picture. Instead, our hands landed on it at exactly the same moment. Neither of us expected it. Our eyes met. For just a second. Long enough that I forgot about the photograph completely. Edgar slowly pulled his hand back. You can laugh. I already am. You'll never let these go. Absolutely not. His smile returned. This one lasted longer. That evening clouds rolled back in. By dinner the wind had become strong enough to shake the windows. You think it'll storm again? I asked. Edgar looked outside. Probably. Almost on cue, thunder rolled across the valley. Perfect. You afraid? I'm respectfully cautious. Of thunder. Of being trapped in a wooden cabin surrounded by trees. You watch too many movies. I watch exactly enough. The power went out halfway through dinner. Everything became dark. A second later, Edgar stood up. Don't move. I wasn't planning to. I heard drawers opening. Then the scratch of a match. A lantern flickered to life between us. Warm yellow light filled the room. It somehow made the cabin feel even older. And now, I said, it officially looks haunted. Edgar laughed. My grandfather always said storms were better without electricity. Your grandfather sounds suspiciously comfortable. He was. The rain began pounding the roof harder than the night before. Branches scraped against the walls. The entire forest seemed alive. We ended up sitting in front of the fireplace again, this time with only lantern light illuminating the room. Outside, thunder echoed through the mountains. Inside, neither of us seemed interested in cards or board games. Edgar stared into the flames. Finally, he spoke. Can I ask you something? Sure. When did you know? I frowned. Know what? He hesitated. When did you know you were different? The question caught me completely off guard. I'd never actually discussed being gay with Edgar. Not beyond mentioning an ex-boyfriend once months earlier. I studied his expression. He wasn't uncomfortable. He wasn't judging me. He looked curious. I don't know, I admitted. Probably high school. He nodded slowly. Were you scared? Terrified. He kept watching the fire. What changed? I got tired of pretending to be someone else. Silence settled between us. Heavy this time. Not awkward. Meaningful. Edgar quietly rubbed his hands together. I always wondered what that felt like. I looked at him. What pretending? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood and walked toward the rain-covered window. I don't know. It wasn't an answer. It sounded like someone trying very hard not to tell the truth. I watched him in silence. For the first time since arriving at the cabin, I wasn't wondering why he'd invited me. I was beginning to wonder what he had been trying to say all along. The storm didn't let up until sometime after midnight. Neither of us mentioned the conversation again. Edgar eventually claimed he was tired and disappeared down the hallway, leaving me alone with the dying fire and far too many thoughts. I lay awake for a long time. His question kept replaying in my head. When did you know? Most straight guys didn't ask questions like that. Or maybe they did. Maybe I was reading into things because I'd spent years accidentally falling for men who could never feel the same way. I hated that habit. It had taught me disappointment better than anything else. So I forced myself to stop thinking about it. At least, I tried. The next morning, the cabin felt unusually quiet. I found Edgar sitting alone on the porch. He was wrapped in a heavy flannel jacket, staring into the trees with a mug balanced between his hands. He looked like he'd been there for a while. You escaped before breakfast. I couldn't sleep. You said that yesterday. I know. I leaned against the porch railing beside him. The air was cold enough that our breath drifted in little clouds. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, Edgar sighed. I'm sorry. For what? For asking you that. It wasn't offensive. I know. He stared at the woods. It was personal. I didn't mind. He nodded, but didn't seem convinced. I've been thinking about things. What kind of things? He smiled without looking at me. The complicated kind. After breakfast, he suggested taking the canoe onto the lake. You own a canoe? My grandfather did. Is it safe? It floats. That wasn't my question. He laughed. It'll be fine. Somehow I wasn't reassured. The lake was perfectly still. Not even a ripple disturbed the surface. Edgar paddled while I did my best to look useful. I feel like you're judging my technique. I absolutely am. I'm trying. I can tell. You could at least pretend I'm helping. You are. He looked at my paddle. Emotionally, I splashed water toward him. He laughed loudly enough to echo across the lake. There he is. What? You've been overthinking everything since last night. I have not. You have. I've been quietly reflecting. That's just overthinking with better marketing. I couldn't help smiling. He knew me too well. We drifted toward the middle of the lake. The cabin looked tiny from out there. So, I finally said. So, you never finished answering me. Edgar frowned. When? Yesterday. He looked away almost immediately. I noticed. Silence. Then he quietly asked, what do you think I was going to say? I considered lying. Instead, I answered honestly. I don't know. That's true. But I hesitated. I don't think you invited me here just to clean your grandfather's cabin. His paddle stopped moving. The canoe drifted silently across the water. No, he admitted. I didn't. He didn't continue. I wasn't sure whether to ask. Eventually, curiosity won. Then why? Edgar stared across the lake for so long I thought he'd changed his mind. Finally, he spoke. Do you remember sophomore year? I laughed. Barely. My birthday. The pizza place? He nodded. There was a group of us. I remember. You left early. I had an exam. He looked down at the water. No. You left because someone made a joke. I searched my memory. At first, nothing came. Then slowly, one sentence resurfaced. One stupid joke from one stupid guy. Careful, Edgar. Chester's probably got a crush on you. Everyone had laughed, including me. I'd shrugged it off. Made another joke. Gone home. I hadn't thought about that night in years. I remember. Edgar nodded slowly. I've always wondered. He stopped. Wondered what? He gave a quiet laugh. It sounds ridiculous now. Try me. He looked directly at me. I wondered if it had been true. Every sound around us disappeared. The birds. The water. The breeze. Everything. No. I answered after several long seconds. It wasn't completely true. Back then I'd thought Edgar was attractive. But attraction wasn't the same thing as love. And I'd buried it before it had become anything dangerous. I didn't. Edgar looked relieved. Then oddly disappointed. I figured. But. He looked back at me. I cared about you. I know. No. I shook my head. I don't think you do. He waited. I spent years making sure I never crossed a line. His expression changed. I knew you were straight. I never wanted our friendship to become awkward. So I never let myself think about what might have happened if things were different. Edgar wasn't looking at the lake anymore. He was looking only at me. I didn't know that. I wasn't supposed to tell you. Another long silence settled over us. This one felt different. Neither comfortable nor uncomfortable. Fragile. On the paddle back, neither of us spoke much. Not because there was nothing to say, because there was suddenly too much. Every glance lasted a second longer than before. Every accidental brush of our shoulders felt strangely noticeable. By the time we reached the dock, my heart had exhausted itself trying to understand what was happening. That afternoon, Edgar disappeared into the woods alone. I won't be long. You sure? Yeah. Need company? He hesitated, then smiled sadly. Not this time. I watched him disappear between the trees. Something about the way he walked looked heavier, like every step required thought. He didn't come back for almost 3 hours. By then the sun was already dropping behind the hills. I was standing on the porch when I finally saw him. He wasn't carrying anything. No firewood. No tools. Nothing. Just himself. You okay? He nodded automatically, then stopped. No. I stepped toward him. What happened? He looked exhausted. Not physically. Emotionally. I've spent almost a year trying to convince myself I invited you here for the cabin. My stomach tightened. But that's not why. The evening breeze stirred the trees around us. Neither of us moved. Edgar looked directly into my eyes. I invited you because I couldn't keep lying to myself anymore. My pulse slammed against my ribs. He took one slow breath. I don't know what this means. I don't know what happens next. I don't even know who I am yet. His voice had become barely louder than the wind. But every time I imagined telling someone, he swallowed. The only person I wanted here, his eyes never left mine, was you. Neither of us moved. The words hung between us like the last light before sunset. I searched Edgar's face for some sign that I'd misunderstood. There wasn't one. He looked terrified. Not of me. Of what he'd finally admitted. I shouldn't have said that, he whispered. You don't mean that. I don't know what I mean. He rubbed both hands across his face, frustrated with himself. I've spent weeks planning this conversation. Weeks. He nodded. And somehow I still managed to say it in the worst possible way. A nervous laugh escaped me. I've heard worse. He smiled weakly. I doubt it. We stayed on the porch until the sun disappeared completely. The silence between us wasn't awkward anymore. It was careful, like both of us understood that one careless sentence could change everything. Finally, I spoke. You don't have to figure everything out tonight. I know. You don't have to explain yourself either. I know. But you're going to try anyway. He laughed quietly. You really do know me. I've known you for 4 years. That's exactly what scares me. Why? He looked down at the wooden porch floor. Because you've known the version of me that made sense. And now, I don't know if I still do. We built another fire after dinner. Neither of us had much appetite. The cabin felt smaller than it had the day before. Not because anything had changed, because everything had. Edgar sat on the rug in front of the fireplace instead of the couch. I joined him. For several minutes, we simply watched the flames. Then he quietly asked, "Can I tell you something embarrassing? I'll probably remind you of it for years." I know. He smiled. That's why I'm hesitating. I waited. When you told me about your ex last year, I remembered the conversation. It had been brief. Nothing dramatic. Just two friends talking after class. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I frowned. Why? Because I realized I'd never been jealous of anyone before. The room became impossibly still. I told myself it wasn't jealousy. What did you call it? He laughed bitterly. Curiosity. And was it? No. He shook his head. It was envy. I didn't interrupt. Edgar seemed to need the space to keep talking. I kept wondering what it would feel like. He searched for the words. To want someone enough to tell them. You've never dated anyone? A few girls. And they were wonderful. He smiled sadly. They deserved someone who wasn't constantly trying to convince himself. My chest tightened. I kept waiting for everything to feel natural. He looked into the fire. It never did. Outside, wind pushed softly through the trees. Inside, the fire cracked quietly between us. I thought coming here would help me forget. Edgar laughed once. Instead, I invited the one person who makes it impossible. I looked at him carefully. You make it sound like I did something. You did. What? You've always been. He stopped. Always been what? Safe. The answer caught me off guard. You never expected anything from me. You listened. You never laughed when I admitted I was struggling. He looked over at me. You made honesty seem possible. I wasn't sure what to say, so I answered with the truth. I've never stopped seeing you as my friend. I know, and nothing you've told me tonight changes that. His shoulders relaxed a little. But, he looked at me again. You don't look relieved. Because that's not all I want to hear. The sentence settled between us. Neither of us looked away. For the first time all weekend, I understood exactly where we stood. Not because he'd confessed some dramatic secret. Because he'd finally allowed himself to hope. Just a little. Enough to be afraid of the answer. I need to tell you something too, I said. Edgar nodded. When we first met, he smiled. I was convinced you hated me. His eyebrows shot upward. What? You barely spoke. I was shy. You looked annoyed. I was terrified. He laughed. Seriously? You were the confident one. I absolutely was not. You fooled everyone. He leaned back against the couch. I spent our entire first semester assuming you thought I was boring. I couldn't help smiling. I thought you were completely out of my league. He stared at me. What? You heard me. I never would have guessed that. I never intended you to. Another quiet silence followed. This one lighter than before. Almost relieved. Later that evening we found ourselves sorting through more old boxes. Most contained tools, fishing equipment, camping supplies. Then Edgar opened a small wooden chest. Inside lay dozens of handwritten letters. They're my grandfather's. You've never read them? He slowly shook his head. No. He picked one up carefully. On the front, in faded ink, was written, "For the days when you're afraid to be honest." Edgar stared at the envelope without moving. His fingers trembled slightly. I didn't know this existed. Maybe you should read it. I don't think I can. You don't have to right now. He looked at me. I think my grandfather knew. Knew what? He smiled sadly. That someday I'd end up exactly here. Much later, after midnight, we stepped outside. The storm had finally passed. The sky was completely clear. Thousands of stars stretched across the darkness. I forgot the sky could look like this, I whispered. Edgar nodded. My grandfather used to bring me outside every clear night. Why? He said whenever life felt confusing. Edgar looked upward. The stars reminded him how small fear really was. I stood beside him in silence. Our shoulders almost touched. Neither of us stepped away. After several minutes, Edgar quietly said, I'm still scared. I know. I'm scared you'll look at me differently. I turned toward him. I already do. His face fell for the briefest second, until I continued. I think you're the bravest I've ever seen you." His eyes searched mine, as if trying to decide whether to believe me. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then, almost absent-mindedly, our hands brushed as we stood side by side. Neither of us pulled away. Neither of us reached for more. We simply remained there under the endless sky, close enough to know that something between us had changed forever, even if neither of us was ready to give it a name. The next morning, neither of us mentioned what had happened beneath the stars. Not because we regretted it, because neither of us wanted to rush whatever was unfolding. I woke to the smell of pancakes. Actual pancakes. I walked into the kitchen and stopped. "You can cook." Edgar looked over his shoulder. "I've been able to cook this whole time. You've hidden this from me for 4 years. I enjoy maintaining an air of mystery." I laughed. "No, you enjoy letting me survive on takeout." Also true. The easy conversation felt like a relief. Not because the difficult one was over, because we hadn't lost this version of ourselves in the process. After breakfast, we carried our mugs onto the porch. The morning sun warmed the old wooden steps. The forest seemed completely different from the day we'd arrived. Or maybe we were. Edgar leaned back in his chair. "I kept expecting today to feel awkward." "Does it?" He thought about it. "No, me neither." He smiled. "I don't know why." "I do." He looked at me. "We've always been honest with each other." "I wasn't." "You are now." He nodded slowly. "Yeah, I guess I am." Around noon, we decided to clear an overgrown trail behind the cabin, mostly because neither of us knew what else to do. Working was easier than sitting still. Edgar hacked away at low branches while I gathered fallen limbs. "You know," I said. You really weren't subtle." "What do you mean?" "Inviting me here." "I thought I was." "You drove 3 hours into the middle of nowhere." "Good point." And then immediately started asking me deeply personal questions. I was nervous. I noticed. "You noticed everything." I smiled. "I usually do." He laughed quietly. "I was hoping maybe you wouldn't this time." "Sorry. I'm actually glad you did." By early afternoon, we'd reached the end of the trail. It opened onto another small clearing. Unlike the lake, almost nobody seemed to have visited this place in years. In the center stood a wooden bench. Old, weathered, handmade. My grandfather built this. Edgar brushed leaves from the seat. "He used to sit here every evening." "Why here?" "He said this was the quietest place on the property." We sat down. The only sound came from birds somewhere high above us. Edgar folded his hands together. "I've imagined this conversation 100 different ways. And none of them looked like this. Worse." He smiled. "Actually." He looked around the clearing. "Better." He took a long breath. "Can I tell you what scared me the most?" "Of course." "I wasn't afraid you'd stop being my friend." I waited. "I was afraid you'd be kind." I frowned. "What?" He gave a nervous laugh. "I knew you'd never make fun of me. I knew you'd listen. I knew you'd tell me it was okay." He looked down. "And somehow that scared me even more." "Why?" "Because if you were kind." He swallowed. "I'd have to stop pretending." The honesty in his voice caught me off guard. For years I'd known Edgar as someone steady, reliable, the person everyone leaned on. I'd never realized how much energy it must have taken to carry everything alone. I've spent so much time trying to become the person everyone expected. He looked toward the trees. My parents, my friends, my teammates, myself. And he smiled sadly. "I'm tired." Without thinking, I reached over and rested my hand on his shoulder. It wasn't planned. It wasn't dramatic. Just instinct. Edgar looked at me. Neither of us spoke. He didn't move away. Instead, he quietly said, "I don't think anyone's ever seen me this clearly. You've been hiding." "I know." It must have been exhausting. It was. He closed his eyes for a moment. "When you said yesterday that I was brave." He opened them again. "I didn't believe you. And now, I'm starting to." We stayed in the clearing until the afternoon shadows stretched across the forest floor. On the walk back, Edgar seemed lighter. Not completely, but enough that I noticed. Halfway down the trail, he suddenly laughed. "What?" "I just realized something." "What?" "You haven't asked me the obvious question." "Which one?" He looked at me with an embarrassed smile. "You haven't asked whether I have feelings for you." I figured if you wanted to tell me, you would. And if I didn't, I wouldn't ask. He stared at me for several seconds. "You always do that." "Do what?" "Give people room. I don't like cornering anyone." He nodded. "That's one of the reasons." He stopped himself. "One of the reasons what?" He smiled. "I wanted you here." Back at the cabin, the afternoon slipped quietly into evening. We packed some of our things since we'd be driving home the next morning. It felt strange. 2 days earlier, this had been nothing more than a weekend trip. Now it felt like the place where both our lives had quietly changed direction. As Edgar folded one of the blankets, he looked up. Chester. Yeah, I don't want to rush anything. I know. I've only just started being honest with myself. I know. I don't even know what dating someone would look like. I smiled gently. You don't have to know today. He let out a relieved breath. I was hoping you'd say that. What I do know, I paused, is that I don't want you making promises because you're overwhelmed. He nodded immediately. I don't. I'd rather have the truth. Even if it's slower? Especially if it's slower. For a long moment, he simply looked at me. Then a genuine smile spread across his face, the most relaxed one I'd seen all weekend. I think, he said quietly, this is the first time in my life I haven't felt pressured to have all the answers. I smiled back. Good. Outside, the sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows across the porch. For the first time since we'd arrived at the cabin, the future didn't feel frightening. It felt unwritten, and somehow that was enough. The last morning arrived too quickly. Sunlight spilled through the cabin windows, filling every room with a warm glow that hadn't existed during the first 2 days. I woke before Edgar. For a while I simply stood on the porch with a mug of coffee, listening to the forest. Everything looked exactly the same. The trees, the lake, the old swing. And yet it felt impossible to believe we were leaving as the same people who had arrived. The cabin hadn't changed us. It had simply stripped away everything we'd been avoiding. The screen door creaked behind me. Edgar stepped outside, still half asleep, carrying his own mug. You've been up long? About 20 minutes. You always wake up early? Only when I know something's ending. He leaned against the railing beside me. I was thinking the same thing. For several minutes we watched the mist drift over the lake. Finally, Edgar spoke. I'm glad you said yes. To the trip? He nodded. I almost canceled it. Really? 3 different times. I looked at him in surprise. Why? He laughed quietly. Because every time I imagined telling you the truth. He shook his head. I imagined driving back alone. After breakfast, we packed the truck. The cabin slowly became empty again. Blankets folded. Lanterns stored away. Fireplace cleaned. It looked exactly as it had when we arrived. Only the two of us knew how much had happened inside those walls. Edgar locked the front door and stood looking at it for a moment. You okay? I think so. He slipped the key into his pocket. My grandfather always said this place helped people find clarity. Was he right? Edgar smiled. I wish I could ask him. So do I. We started the drive home just before noon. For almost an hour, neither of us said much. Not because we were uncomfortable, because neither of us wanted the weekend to end. Eventually, Edgar broke the silence. Can I ask you something else? You've been asking a lot of questions lately. I noticed. What is it? He kept his eyes on the road. When we get back. He hesitated. What happens? I thought carefully before answering. The same thing that happened before. He glanced at me. We're friends. I know. We go to class. We complain about assignments. We get coffee. He smiled. And I met his eyes for a brief second before he looked back at the road. We stopped pretending this conversation never happened. His shoulders visibly relaxed. I can do that. We stopped at a small roadside diner halfway home. The place looked like it hadn't changed since the 1980s. Vinyl booths. Old country music playing quietly. A waitress who greeted everyone by name except us. As we waited for lunch, Edgar stirred his coffee absent-mindedly. I keep expecting to wake up. From what? This weekend. You think it's a dream? No. He smiled. I think I've been asleep for a long time. The food arrived. Conversation drifted toward ordinary things again. Movies. Classes. Friends. It felt surprisingly natural. At one point, Edgar laughed so hard at one of my terrible jokes that coffee almost came out of his nose. There he is, I said. What? The Edgar I actually know. He looked at me for a second. I think you're meeting him for the first time. The sentence stayed with me long after we left the diner. By late afternoon, the city skyline appeared in the distance. Traffic returned. Billboards. Noise. People. Everything we'd temporarily escaped. Edgar grew quieter the closer we got. You nervous? I asked. A little. About what? He sighed. Real life. I understood exactly what he meant. The cabin had been private. Safe. The The city was where uncertainty lived. He pulled into the parking lot outside my apartment. Neither of us reached for our bags immediately. "So," Edgar said. "So, this feels weird." "A little." He smiled nervously. "I don't really know how people end weekends like this. I don't think there are rules. That's inconvenient." "I know." We both laughed. Then the silence returned. Not uncomfortable, just important. Finally, Edgar looked at me. "I meant what I said. I know. I don't know where this leads. I know. But I don't want to lose you." "You won't." He searched my face, making sure I meant it. "I promise." His expression softened. "Thank you." I opened the passenger door, then paused. "Hey. Yeah. Next weekend." He looked curious. "We're getting coffee." He smiled. "Just coffee. Let's start there." He nodded. "I'd like that." I grabbed my bag and climbed out of the truck. As I reached the apartment entrance, I turned back. Edgar was still sitting behind the wheel, watching. When our eyes met, he gave a small wave. Not dramatic, not emotional, just genuine. I smiled and waved back before disappearing inside. For the rest of the evening, I kept expecting my phone to stay silent. Instead, around 9 o'clock, it buzzed. "Edgar, made it home." A few seconds later, another message appeared. "Edgar, thanks for coming with me." I smiled before replying. "Chester." I'd go again. The typing bubble appeared almost instantly, then disappeared, then returned. Finally, his message arrived. "Edgar, I think next time it won't just be about the cabin." The week after the trip felt strangely normal, which, somehow, was the hardest part. Monday morning, I saw Edgar across campus exactly where I usually did. Same backpack, same coffee, same easy smile when he spotted me. For a split second, I wondered if we'd both imagined everything that had happened at the cabin. Then he walked over. "Morning. Morning. You slept?" "Eventually." "You?" He smiled. "Better than I have in months." That answered my question. Nothing had been imagined. We kept our promise. Nothing dramatic changed overnight. We still studied together, still complained about professors, still argued over where to eat. The difference wasn't in what we did. It was in what no longer stood between us. There was no invisible wall anymore. No conversation carefully avoided. No version of Edgar pretending to be someone else around me. He laughed more. He relaxed more. Sometimes I catch him smiling for no reason at all. "You've been doing that a lot." "What?" Smiling. He looked genuinely confused. "Have I?" "Yeah." He thought about it. "I guess I have." Saturday arrived. Our coffee turned into breakfast. Breakfast somehow became a walk through the park. Neither of us seemed interested in going home. "I forgot what free weekends felt like," Edgar admitted. "You were always busy." "I was always distracting myself." "From thinking." He nodded. "From feeling." We found an empty bench overlooking a small pond. Families walked by. Dogs chased tennis balls. Everything around us felt wonderfully ordinary. Edgar rested his elbows on his knees. I told my sister. I looked at him. "Everything. Almost. How did it go?" He smiled. "She said she'd been waiting for me to stop overthinking." I laughed. "She knows you well." "Apparently, everyone does." He glanced sideways at me. "You most of all." A few days later, we were studying at the library when Edgar suddenly closed his textbook. "I need some air." Outside, we wandered slowly across campus. "I've been thinking." "I know that look." He laughed. "Is it that obvious?" "You get quieter." "I do." We stopped beneath a row of old maple trees. Students passed around us without paying attention. "I don't want to keep pretending this is just another friendship." My heart sped up. "I don't either." He took a slow breath. "I don't know how to do this." "You don't have to." "What do you mean?" "I don't need you to have experience." "I don't." "I know. I just need you to be honest." He smiled softly. "I can do that." For a long moment, we simply stood there. The city buzzed around us. Cars. Conversations. The normal rhythm of everyday life. Edgar looked strangely calm. "You know what's funny?" "What?" "I spent years terrified that if I admitted any of this." He looked around campus. "My whole world would fall apart." And it didn't. He laughed quietly. "It just got bigger." Over the next month, life found a new rhythm. Slowly, naturally. Nothing happened because either of us forced it. Sometimes we'd spend hours talking. Sometimes we'd sit quietly with coffee. Sometimes we'd drive nowhere in particular, just because neither of us wanted the conversation to end. One evening, we found ourselves back at the overlook outside the city where we'd watched sunsets during college. The sky turned orange, then pink, then deep blue. Edgar leaned against the hood of his truck. I've been meaning to ask you something. Another question? I know. You ask a lot of them. This one's important. I waited. He smiled nervously. Would you like to go on an actual date? I couldn't help laughing. You mean not accidentally? Exactly. No pretending it's just coffee. No pretending we're just killing time. He looked more nervous than I'd ever seen him. I'd really like that. I smiled. I would too. The relief on his face made me laugh again. You were worried I'd say no? I've been worried about everything. I noticed. A month later, we drove back to the cabin. This time the trip felt different from the moment we left the city. Not because we'd suddenly become different people, because neither of us was hiding anymore. The forest greeted us with the same quiet. The lake reflected the same sky. The old porch still creaked. Edgar unlocked the front door and stood there for a moment. I think I finally understand why my grandfather loved this place. Why? He looked around the empty cabin before smiling at me. Because sometimes you need somewhere quiet enough to hear the truth. We spent the evening walking to the lake. The same trail, the same water, the same peaceful silence. Only this time there was no fear hanging between us. No confession waiting to happen. No impossible secret. As darkness settled over the trees, Edgar looked across the lake and smiled. You know? What? I'm really glad you came that first weekend. I looked at him. So am I. He laughed softly. You almost said no. I know. Why did you finally agree? I thought about it for a moment, then answered honestly. Because you asked. He smiled, shaking his head. No. What? I think you came because somewhere deep down. He looked out over the water. You already knew I needed you. I smiled. Maybe. The breeze stirred the surface of the lake. We stood there side by side, watching the last light disappear behind the trees. Months earlier, we'd arrived at this cabin carrying questions we were too afraid to ask. Now we were leaving with something much quieter. Not certainty, not perfection, just the comfort of knowing we no longer had to face the future alone. And somehow, that was everything. About 6 months later, Edgar called me on a Thursday evening. You busy this weekend? I was planning to catch up on laundry. I have a better idea. That sounds suspicious. It usually is. I smiled. What are we doing? There was a short pause. I want to go back. To the cabin? Yeah. I didn't even pretend to think about it. What time are we leaving? The drive felt completely different this time. The nervousness was gone. Instead, we talked almost the entire way. About work. About my disastrous attempt at cooking pasta. About Edgar finally telling 2 more of his closest friends. How'd that go? I asked. He smiled to himself. I spent 2 days rehearsing. I believe that. They listened. And they asked why I looked so relieved. I laughed. What did you tell them? The truth. And what was that? That I'd finally stopped hiding from myself. The cabin looked exactly as it always had. The porch still creaked. The old swing still moved gently in the wind. The lake still reflected the evening sky like polished glass. Only now, every corner of the place reminded me of conversations instead of uncertainty. Edgar unlocked the front door and looked around with a smile. You know? What? I used to think this place was where my grandfather came to escape. And now, I think he came here to be honest. That evening we carried our coffee down to the lake. The same dock, the same calm water, the same sunset. For a while we simply watched the light fade. Then Edgar quietly said, I read the letter. I turned toward him. The one your grandfather left? He nodded. I couldn't do it that weekend. What did it say? He smiled softly. It wasn't about hunting. No. He shook his head. It said. He paused, remembering every word. If you're reading this because you're afraid of disappointing people, remember this. The people who truly love you would rather know the real you than spend a lifetime loving someone you invented. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. He knew. I whispered. I think he did. Edgar looked out across the lake. For years I thought I was protecting everyone. And now, I realize I was only making myself lonely. As darkness settled over the water, we walked slowly back toward the cabin. Halfway along the trail, Edgar stopped. I've never thanked you properly. You don't have to. I do. He looked at me with the same expression he'd worn months earlier on the porch, only this time there was no fear behind it. You could have walked away. I know. You could have told me I was confused. I know. You could have decided it was too complicated. I smiled. But I didn't. No. He laughed quietly. You made everything feel possible. I thought about the first weekend, the sleepless night, the fire tower, the storm, the conversations in front of the fireplace, how frightened he'd been to say the words out loud, and how impossible it seemed back then that we'd ever stand here without that fear. I didn't do that. He frowned. No. I shook my head. You did. He looked genuinely confused. You were the one who decided to be honest. I just stayed long enough to hear it. The next morning we sat on the porch drinking coffee as the sun climbed above the trees. Edgar leaned back in his chair and smiled. I've been thinking. That usually means another question. It does. I laughed. Go ahead. If I hadn't invited you here that first weekend. He looked toward the forest. Do you think any of this would have happened? I looked around the cabin one last time. At the old swing, the weathered porch, the path leading to the lake, then back at him. I honestly don't know. He nodded. Neither do I. But I do know something else. What's that? I smiled. I'm really glad you asked. He laughed the same easy, genuine laugh that had become so familiar over the past months. The forest answered with nothing but birdsong and the whisper of wind through the pines. When we finally locked the cabin and started the drive home, I glanced back one last time. It wasn't the place where I fell in love. It wasn't even the place where Edgar admitted the truth. It was simply the place where two lifelong friends stopped pretending they had to face life alone. Sometimes people think love begins with one unforgettable moment. A confession, a grand gesture, a perfect sentence. Ours didn't. It began with an invitation to a quiet hunting cabin, a weekend neither of us expected, and one simple decision to tell the truth before it was too late. Looking back now, I don't remember the storms as much as I remember the silence afterward. Not the silence of uncertainty. The silence of finally feeling at home beside someone who knew exactly who I was. And if you asked me today what my favorite place in the world is, I'd still tell you it's that old hunting cabin in the woods. Not because of the cabin itself, but because that's where Edgar finally found the courage to become himself. And where I learned that sometimes the greatest adventure has nothing to do with the wilderness outside. Sometimes it's simply finding the courage to stop running from your own heart.